Are you still talking about Jeffrey Epstein? This guy's been talked about for years. You're asking, we have Texas, we have this, we have all of the things. And are people still talking about this guy, this creep? That is unbelievable. It just seems like a desecration.
Ja, god morgon. Välkommen till ännu en förinspelad frukostklubb. Och det ska handla om ett ställe i New Mexico. Epstein hade ju en ranch där. Och den lär ju ha varit mycket värre än ön som är mest känd. Alltså Epsteins ö. Men på den här ranchen så sägs det ha förekommit kloning av barn, otäcka experiment och Bill Gates lär ha varit där ganska mycket och hälsa på. Och det verkar vara ett riktigt monster, den här Bill Gates. Men den här videon är från kanalen Redacted och jag kör igång den på en gång här.
Well, less than 2 hours after our report on Zorro Ranch ran yesterday, New Mexico says it has approved a probe into Epstein's Zorro Ranch for the very first time. They have now approved this comprehensive probe. So let me just read right from the Reuters piece here to be specific. New Mexico lawmakers on Monday passed legislation to launch what they said was the first full investigation into what happened at Zorro Ranch, where the late U.S. sex offender Jeffrey Epstein is accused of trafficking and sexually assaulting girls and women. What about the murder, by the way, that shows up in the Epstein files? No mention of that. But a bipartisan committee will seek testimony from survivors of alleged sexual abuse at the ranch located about 30 miles south of Santa Fe, the state capital. Legislators are also urging local residents to testify. Well, way to catch up. Glad you finally joined in the party. Welcome to the party, pal. Zorro Ranch of all. We looked at everything else. We looked at his, Paris house. We looked at his Upper East Side house. We looked at the island. We looked in Florida. But the ranch, we just decided to leave that off, whatever. I think we got enough stuff here. Anyway, Elisa Martinez, she's a former U.S. Senate candidate from New Mexico, who's been absolutely vocal about the anti-sex trafficking and what they can do to stop it in the state of New Mexico. She knows this place very, very well, and also the very horribly nefarious things that have been happening in New Mexico, from organ harvesting and child sex trafficking. And, of course, Zorro Ranch sits really at the center of a lot of that. Elisa joins us now. Great to have you here on the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So when I just want to, first of all, at a 30,000 foot level, what the hell? Why now? Are we finally getting a probe into this ranch? People like you have been singing from the rooftops, please, or shouting from the rooftops, please investigate this stuff.
Absolutely. And that's probably the biggest takeaway is 7 years later, why are we now calling on an investigation when the bodies have been buried, the evidence most likely is missing, gone, tampered with. And so I believe that this is really just about damage control for the party in power in New Mexico, which has been the Democrat Party for really 90 years. And quite frankly, has allowed for this ranch to operate freely for almost 26 years, even to date, even after the arrest, after the email drops, after everything that's come to light, has still yet to be investigated. And I will also note that the former governor, Bill Richardson, who only died just in 2023, many of the members on the committee that voted for this commission yesterday, which I was present at that vote, were really giving accolades to this former disgraced Democrat governor, Bill Richardson, who was a frequent friend and visitor of Zorro Ranch.
Of course.
What?
And Bill Clinton, of course, and very, very cushy with Bill Clinton, of course.
So how long has there been rumblings that there were nefarious things happening at this ranch, and how have they been covered up for decades? Because many of us just learned about it from this document, and we didn't have our eye on New Mexico at all.
Well, that's a great point. I don't think a lot of local residents were even aware as well of the ranch operating there. And I find it interesting that, over the 26 plus years or so that ranch has been under the ownership of Epstein, that Santa Fe, which is the closest, nearest well-known city, was also becoming a mecca for the stars. So you have multi-million-dollar A-list celebrities like Oprah, like others that were moving to Santa Fe, and it was becoming this mecca for the stars. So, but we do know that the former governor Bill Richardson, was pretty well known amongst many circles that he was a womanizer. He was, a cheater, a prolific cheater, and just all around a very questionable character that really came to our state in order to carpetbag. He had a relationship, again, as we know, with Bill Clinton, and was under an appointee of Bill Clinton during the Clinton eras. So we know that we know that there was this relationship there as well, and that Richardson himself was a very just a dark character.
So Vonda in our chat room says, please do not only be focused on the rich and powerful perpetrators. Please look into all the doctors, nurses, staff members, dentists, gynecologists, etc. All the ordinary people who encountered these victims. What do you say about that? Great point.
I think it's an excellent point, especially now that we're seeing come to light, and it did come to light previously, but not as prominent with this baby breeding factory or baby breeding program that Epstein wanted to operate out of Zorro Ranch, again, because it's in the middle of nowhere. It's a huge ranch, a huge property that is operating, with no oversight, and the proximity to the University of New Mexico, where we had baby body part harvesting going on for 20 plus years. This is a similar but different situation with Epstein, that he wanted to breed. He wanted to build a baby breeding factory using his DNA, of course, to perpetuate, a new breed of human beings with his DNA. And so a lot of nefarious activities took place there. And again, this investigation that is being launched by our local lawmakers hopefully will bring to light more local input and tips, but so far it's been a dead end. Our attorney general, launched an investigation that came up with no findings back in 2019 when this all broke. The only elected official to remotely even take any concrete action is the land commissioner, who basically terminated contracts with the property and is at least calling for an investigation of any bodies that might be buried there.
Do you want to put up this email here? Because this was one of the revelations that came out of the Epstein files, which is, we read this yesterday, but this is one of the most telling pieces. Edward, this is sensitive, so it will be the first and last email depending on your discretion. You can choose to take it or trash it, but this comes from a person that has been there and seen it all as a former staff member at Zorro Ranch. The material below was taken from Jeffrey Epstein's home as my insurance in case of future litigation against Epstein. Sorry, no questions. What is damning about Epstein is yet to be written. Did you know somewhere in the hills outside of the Zorro Ranch, 2 foreign girls were buried there on orders of Epstein and Madame Ghislaine Maxwell?
Ja, jag tvivlar ju på att de kommer gå grundligt tillväga när de undersöker det här stället. Jag tror inte att de kommer gå runt med hundar och lukta reda på begravda kroppar. För det tror jag inte, utan det här är mer ett spel för galleriet, en så kallad skadekontroll. Det här stället lär ju ha varit något i paritet med greve Draculas slott i Transylvanien. Alltså vidriga saker har hänt på det här stället med underjordiska tortyrkammare. Epstein var ju till exempel fixerad vid tandläkarstolar, och enligt vissa dokument här så har man använt de här tandläkarstolarna med barn och dragit ut tänderna på dem bara för att de inte ska kunna bita förövarna när de blir sexuellt utnyttjade. Det är så vidrigt så att man orkar knappt lyssna på såna här berättelser.
Both died by strangulation during rough fetish sex. And it goes on. So that's one of the big questions here, is bodies buried on the ranch, or and maybe you can educate all of us, there's state land which abuts the ranch. And so maybe bodies are even buried on state land that sits adjacent to the ranch. Can you talk about that piece of it?
Sure. So this came to light again back in 2019. This is where the land commissioner of New Mexico, I believe at the time, Stephanie Garcia Richard, did call for a cease of contracts because the land did, it was next to state land, and there were some lease agreements with the property, the Zorro Ranch property, that were halted by the land commissioner. But again, the tip that you're speaking of, that now we have concrete evidence in the files, was a tip that came to light several years ago, that those at least two bodies that we know of were buried there, of these two foreign young women that died during disgusting acts that they were forced into, most likely. And so now that we have the concrete evidence, that land needs to be investigated immediately for any other additional burials that might have taken place, that we know are taking place, that there are victims that are disposable to these individuals in elite circles. And of course, as your previous commenter said, anyone else who was involved needs to be brought to account. We need to start seeing some accountability. We need to start seeing arrests. We need to start seeing arraignments. We need to see some action now that the evidence is concrete.
Right. Murder should have brought about some kind of indictment if that in fact happened. The problem is that, like you said, you think a lot of the evidence is tampered with. Interesting that there were New Mexico airports closed over the last week after these revelations, so we don't know if those are connected. But the absence of findings from these new attempts to investigate won't really tell us much. We can't put stock in the fact that they may not find anything, right?
I would agree at this point. Again, we're talking 7 years later to 2019. But in addition to that, I think that it's a highly partisan committee that is overseeing the investigation of their maybe some of their friends and definitely some of their former colleagues. Another note that needs to be brought to light here in this discussion is that former Governor Bill Richardson, under his tutelage and mentorship, is the current governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham, who served on his cabinet while he was visiting Zorro Ranch as the governor. And so now Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, I believe, was on an aging, health and aging cabinet secretary, and now she is our current governor. And these are the individuals in power that are going to be involved with investigating. It is a legislative committee, but that connection also needs to be brought to light.
Right. And I apologize that the airport closures were in El Paso, not in Santa Fe.
Yeah.
My apologies.
So when you look at, when people are saying this is worse than Epstein Island, why would they say that? What stands out to you about Zorro Ranch specifically, or the infrastructure in New Mexico that makes it even worse or less remote than Epstein Island, and where they could bring in more girls? Or, I guess, could you help me unpack that a little bit?
Sure. Well, again, New Mexico, by nearly every metric, is, we have a saying, it's last in everything good and first in everything bad, because of sadly, and so because of the high poverty rates, the high government dependency, the high alcoholism rates, the high rates of abortions, you have a lot of problems in the state that I think are not being addressed legally. In addition, I have here with me the release from the New Mexico Department of Public Safety, where Epstein was not required by the state of New Mexico to not report his previous sex offender status when that was prosecuted in Florida. So we have really an ended state where, children were trafficked here. The proximity to the border, as well, is my understanding, is a reason why our state was targeted by this Epstein pedophile ring. Proximity to traffic young children and women from the border, but also the lack of really any sort of protections in the law for children. In fact, we had I think in the last year, 11 children died under our Children, Youth, and Families Division care. We had reports of children that were sleeping overnight in the offices of the CYFD. So it's just a mess here. And so I think nobody here is surprised that they were able to operate this ranch and this operation with little accountability.
Yeah.
Before we get to the organ harvesting piece of this story, which is horrible, I want to ask you, someone even in our chat room is saying, where are the Epstein babies? That, as you pointed out, at Epstein Ranch, clearly he was trying to procreate with as many people as possible and to carry on the whatever he believed was some sort of super genes. Do we have any accounting of where these Epstein babies might be, if they're still alive?
I mean, I think that's $1 million question that we won't know the answers to. We may never know the answers to. And it's just so tragic that life in New Mexico it comes at is just disposable. We also just saw this month, and one of the bills that I'm involved with advocating for is safe haven baby boxes where a parent can anonymously leave a baby. Well, we can't seem to address that in our legislature, despite the fact that the state has just this year again, another baby was found thrown in a septic tank and drowned from that. And so it's really tragic here, the way that life, especially newborn and unborn life, is being just tossed in the trash. So that's a great question. I'm not sure where those babies are to this day.
All right, let's talk about the organ harvesting, because New Mexico Center and really one, I guess you can speak to this, but so Zorro Ranch sits there, but then of course you've got the massive amount of money that's made from organ harvesting. And of course the massive child trafficking operation in New Mexico. And I know you've been really outspoken about this, and the NIH and their studies in that region. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. So we led an investigation, or I was involved in an investigation back in 2015-16 that involved the University of New Mexico, which is just an hour away or so from Santa Fe, from Epstein Zorro's ranch, where they were conducting research involving human body parts from aborted babies that were, upwards of 23, 24 weeks. They were harvesting organs, pancreas, hearts, 26 hearts for one study alone, from later term babies that are being aborted in New Mexico. It's a very lucrative operation. And so the University of New Mexico had a partnership with one of the local late term abortion centers, and they were harvesting and sifting through these body parts on a regular basis. In fact, we have a published what they call procurement notebook of all of these body parts that they were sifting through in order to use for research that was funded by the NIH.
And Fauci directly involved in this?
I believe so. If not, when he was director of NIH, he was also involved in the NIH for many years. And so, so there's a lot of problems here that are just not being uncovered and not being prosecuted. It was the same Attorney General, Hector Balderas, that was tasked with investigating the violation of law involving this human trafficking and experimentation at the University of New Mexico, because they were not properly receiving the consent from women to experiment with their babies' body parts. And so there were many violations of the law that were potential violations that were identified in that process that never got prosecuted there as well.
Yeah, so the Democrats can pass this new committee to look at Zorro Ranch, but they're nearly 100 years later. Yeah, their 100 years of leadership in that state has allowed government institutions and funding of organ harvesting and all sorts of horrible things in the state of New Mexico. Elisa, thank you for this. I guess we'll be watching very closely as this investigation unfolds. They have until July, I think, to submit their report, their findings. I think, is that right?
I believe it concludes in December, so they might have time to submit. But the commission concludes at the end of this year. And I would add also, there are other elected officials. Just really quick to note that the Zorro Ranch property, was sold by former Democrat Governor Bruce King to Epstein. So the property was in the hands of the former governor. And then we have other Democrat members of the Senate, U.S. Senate, current U.S. Senator Martin Heinrich, who begged to meet with Epstein to support his Senate campaign, I believe back in 2012. So, and other candidates that received money from Epstein, and I'm not sure whatever happened with that.
Well, we're just starting to peel this onion back. It just keeps getting rotten, more rotten and more rotten. Lisa, thank you so much for your work on this, and we really appreciate it. We'll stay in touch.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Ja, sen har det ju kommit fram mer och mer spekulationer om att Jeffrey Epstein blev utsmugglad ur fängelset och att han troligtvis befinner sig i Israel. För att det var inte samma kropp som fördes ut ur fängelset. Det var inte Epstein utan näsan var helt annorlunda och dessutom på vänster arm så har Epstein ett stort tatuering. Och det fanns ingen tatuering på vänsterarmen på den kroppen som skulle då föreställa honom. En annan detalj är ju att för 10 dagar sedan så blev ju Ghislaine Maxwell intervjuad och förhörd. Men man tror ju inte alls att det var hon. Man undrar ju, är hon också i Israel? Har hon blivit frisläppt och det sitter någon annan body double där som liknar henne i fängelset? För att jag har en kort video här om det. Jag tror jag har lagt upp den i förrgår på YouTube. Och man ser ju här klart och tydligt på öronen och på näsan att det här är 2 olika personer. Jag spelar upp den direkt här.
On whether this is Ghislaine Maxwell or is this Ghislaine Maxwell or are they both Ghislaine Maxwell? And in the spirit of investigative research, I decided, hey, you know what? Let's line up the photos. Let's take a close look at them and let's try to be as objective as we can possibly be, trying to steer away from any kind of pitfalls of cognitive bias. So what I did was I put this photo in Photoshop along with 2 other known photos of Ghislaine Maxwell. The first thing I did is I put yellow dots where her pupils are, and then I went from the very top of the ear to the very top of the ear, which skirted right underneath her eyelids. And the reason I did this is I wanted to line up the pupils especially, but I tried to line up the pupils and the ears as well as I could. And when I got all 3 photos in place, there were 2 things that jumped off the screen right off the bat. See if it's as noticeable to you as it was to me as I show you an older picture of Ghislaine Maxwell before she went into prison. What's the first thing that jumps out at you and screams, hey, something ain't right here? I'll tell you what it was for me. Number 1, it was the nose. Look how right here, right before she went to prison, she's got kind of a W-shaped nose. It kind of dips down. Right here, it's completely absent. You don't see that. So here's before, here's after. By the way, this right here was taken from the February 9th deposition. This is February 9th, 2026, just a couple days ago, where she multiple times invoked her 5th Amendment right to be silent and not incriminate herself. So here's the deposition photo, and here's a photo before she went to prison. You see that? Now look at the line. This line right here goes from ear top to ear top, but then right here it goes through the top of her ears. It looks like there's maybe a 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch on the top. This right here is the very top. Now I understand there's lighting, there's camera angle. This camera angle right here could be down like this. This camera angle could be pointed up, which would kind of make things seem just a little bit uneven.
Nej, men det där var ju 2 helt olika personer. Det ser man ju klart och tydligt. Nu ska jag läsa någonting också. Först ska jag läsa om Sveriges Radio-kampanjen till svenskar. Det är från Samnytt. Lotta vill prova fasta under Ramadan. Då Ramadan närmar sig fylls också medierna traditionsenligt med artiklar och inslag om den muslimska fastemånaden. Statsradion drar sitt strå till stacken för att normalisera islams närvaro i det svenska samhället med ett inslag om en integrationssamordnare som funderar på att fasta. Ramadan innebär 30 dagar av fasta för muslimer och har tills nyligen varit ett nästintill okänt fenomen i Sverige, men med inflödet av muslimska migranter påhejat av aningslösa politiker har det blivit något svenska folket ska påtvingas i såväl medierna som ute i butikerna. Lotta Jonsson är integrationssamordnare i Bollebygds kommun och överväger att fasta under Ramadan. Det ansåg P4 Sjuhärad vara så pass intressant att man gjorde ett helt inslag om hennes funderingar. Jag skulle vara nyfiken och se om jag skulle klara av det och hur jag skulle uppleva det, säger hon. En reporter berättar på knagglig svenska att Jonsson under flera år i sitt jobb mött människor som fastar under Ramadan. Att prova på att fasta sägs inte bara handla om den personliga utmaningen i hennes fall utan också den mer empatiska sidan av högtiden. Att du tänker på dem som inte kan äta sig mätta, och inte alla äter sig mätta oavsett om det är i Sverige eller någon annanstans. Och det tänker jag är mänskligt att också få lov att känna. Det tycker jag är fint med Ramadan. Ja, alltså det är ju ingen riktig fasta, det är ju fuskfasta. Och det finns ju bevis på att muslimer äter mera under Ramadan totalt sett om man ser till hela dygnet än vad de gör normalt när de bara äter på dagtid. För de vräker i sig på kvällen och likaså på morgonen innan solen går upp. Så att det finns statistik på att det köps mer mat under Ramadan, så att kalla det här för en fasta, det är bara ett arabiskt lurendrejeri, ett stort jävla skämt, hela cirkusen. Nu ska jag läsa någonting om knäböjning i Israel, och det är från Fria Tider. Efter knäböjningen, Sverigedemokrat topp får förstärkt skydd av Säpo. Ett klipp som visar hur SD-toppen Alexander Kristiansson gråtande går ner på knä inför en israelisk bosättare har fått viral internationell spridning och väckt stor avsky. Nu försvaras han av sin partikollega Mattias Karlsson, som uppger att Kristiansson tvingas stärka sitt Säpo-skydd. Min vän och SD som parti hånas och förlöjligas nu av hundratusentals extremister världen över, konstaterar Karlsson. Klippet med Alexander och bosättaren är egentligen från 2024, men tidigare i februari började det få mycket stor spridning internationellt på sociala medier med miljontals visningar bara på X. Kristiansson, som är SDs kulturpolitiska talesperson, reagerade själv på spridningen genom att anklaga nazisterna och vänstern för att ha organiserat en gemensam smutskastningskampanj mot honom. Nu väljer SD-toppen Mattias Karlsson att ta partikollegan i försvar i ett långt inlägg på X, där han uppger att Säpo behöver stärka skyddet av Kristiansson på grund av den omfattande omfattande spridningen av filmen. I islamistiska och samt vänster- och höger antisemitiska kretsar har videoklippet av denna händelse blivit sinnebilden av en konspiratorisk nidbild och en bekräftelse på att SD och den nya högern kryper för att underkasta sig den sionistiska omnipotenta världsregimen. På grund av denna nidbild har min vän Alexander och hans familj nu fått motta så mycket hot och hat att de behöver förstärkt skydd av Säpo. Allt detta beror enligt Karlsson på att Alexander vid ett besök i Israel för ett par år sedan satte sig på ett knä, böjde sitt huvud, fällde en tår och tröstande la sin hand på en sörjande judisk man. Mattias Karlsson ger också den egentliga bakgrunden till det nu globalt spridda videoklippet. Han beskriver hur det brast för Kristiansson när han träffade den israeliska bosättaren, vars son som var soldat dödas i strider med Hamas. I detta ögonblick brast det för Alexander, som själv är flerbarnsfar. I en gest av medkännande och medlidande med den sörjande mannen sätter han sig på ett knä och lägger med en tår rinnande nerför kinden sin hand på den sörjande faderns ben. Till saken hör att Alexander har en stark gudstro och är uppväxt i en frikyrklig miljö. Att knäböja i bön och lägga sin hand på en medmänniska som lider i förhoppningen om att denna ska få sitt lidande mildrat av Gud är för honom helt naturlig sak att göra, skriver Mattias Karlsson. Han fortsätter: det är denna osjälviska handling utförd i den kontext som jag ovan beskrivit som resulterar i att min vän och SD som parti nu hånas och förlöjligas av hundratusentals extremister världen över, och att mordhoten haglar över en person som inte gjort sig skyldig till något annat än att visa medkänsla med en far som fått se sitt barn mördat av islamister. Ja, den här soldaten då, hur många barn och kvinnor har inte de mördat på Gazaremsan? Fast det tänker ju inte SD på, de tänker ju bara på de stackars israelerna. Svaren på Karlssons inlägg är till stor del hånfulla. Den dagen SD börjar bry sig om det svenska folket som det bryr sig om Israel kan det möjligen finnas en ljusning, skriver användaren Fredrik Morenius i en replik som fått över 100 gilla-markeringar. Användare Monke kommenterar: ni är helt värdelösa. Jag tycker verkligen synd om alla 50-plussare som tror att SD är nationalister och att ni har för avsikt att rädda Sverige från den mångkulturella soptipp landet har förvandlats till. Ni bokstavligen säljer era rövar. Ja, det var allt vad jag hade att komma med. Jag önskar alla en god fortsättning på dagen, och imorgon så blir det en riktig livesändning och inte en förinspelad som idag. Hej då!